Before the incendiary heat of the Bolshevik Revolution began to scorch the foundations of the Russian Empire, melting away the rigid stratifications of its upper crust, the German language was a staple in the refined household of the respected Petrograd senator Shulgin. It was a time when the aristocracy looked westward for culture, and the cadence of foreign tongues was as common in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg as the clinking of porcelain tea sets. In this environment, education was not merely for the masters, it trickled down to the service staff, a peculiar benevolence of the era. Thus, the servants in the senator's residence were expected to learn a foreign language. Among these servants was Nina Vasilyevna Skokova. She was a simple country girl, born of the earth and poverty, who had come to the imperial capital seeking a life beyond the muddy fields of her village. The Shulgin family took a shining to her. They saw a spark in her, a quiet intelligence and grace that belied her humble origins. They decided to take her under their wing, intending to secure her future, perhaps elevating her from a maid to a governess, ensuring she had skills that would outlast her youth. They taught her German, drilling the grammar and vocabulary until the guttural sounds rolled off her tongue with a fluency that would, decades later, define the tragic trajectory of her daughter's life. But the future the Shulgins planned for Nina was incinerated by history. Her destiny was not shaped by the benevolent hand of a senator, but by the furies unleashed by Vladimir Lenin. The revolution of 1917 tore through Petrograd, stripping the wealthy of their homes and the servants of their masters. The senator's household dissolved, and Nina Vasilyevna Skokova was cast out into a new, terrifying world. The governess in training was forced to shed her refined aspirations and return to labor, transforming into a bakery worker to survive the famine and chaos that followed the collapse of the monarchy. It was in this crucible of change that she met Pavel Vasilyevich Kuzmin. Pavel was a study in contrasts, an adventurer born into a well-to-do bourgeois family who had turned his back on his class to embrace the red heat of the revolutionary fever. He was a man of intense charisma and restless energy, swept up in the utopian promises of the Bolsheviks. He did not just observe the revolution, he became its instrument, actively participating in the bloody civil war on the side of the Reds, fighting to dismantle the very world that had birthed him. When the smoke of the civil war cleared and the Bolsheviks stood as victors over the ruins of the Russian Empire, Pavel was poised for advancement. As a war hero, he was slated to undergo officer training, a path that promised status and stability in the new Soviet order. However, the rigidity of military life, the mindless drill, and the unquestioning discipline were anathema to his spirited nature. He was a revolutionary, not a bureaucrat or a soldier of the line. Realizing he was incapable of the blind obedience required of an officer, he left the military. Instead, he joined the legions of enthusiasts who flocked to the Volkhov River, eager to build the future with their bare hands by constructing the hydroelectric power plant, a symbol of Soviet industrial might. It was the collision of these two disparate lives, the former servant girl with her aristocratic education, and the bourgeois revolutionary turned builder, that led to the birth of a new generation. It was thanks to these two people that I came into the world on September 16, 1924, says Jelena Posnik, reflecting on her origins. She was the eldest of their three daughters, born into a time when the old moralities were being questioned as vigorously as the old politics. My parents never married. My father simply didn't want to get married, and my mother didn't care for a wedding ceremony either. Their union was a modern one, forged in the fires of a new society that viewed marriage as a bourgeois relic. Jelena grew up in a household that vibrated with the political energy of the time. She recalls the atmosphere vividly, a childhood soundtracked by the ideology of the state. When my father rocked us, he would sing about how Lenin, Trotsky, and Lunacharsky met together with the proletarian people. It was a lullaby of the revolution, a soft crooning about the architects of the terror that would eventually consume millions, sung with the tenderness of a father putting his children to sleep. The family navigated the harsh landscape of the 1930s relatively peacefully, a feat in itself given the purges and famine that stalked the decade. They lived a nomadic existence, moving often as the Soviet industrial machine demanded, but Pavel Vasilyevich Kuzmin's revolutionary merits served as a shield. Wherever they went, he secured decent jobs and housing, privileges afforded to those who had bled for the cause in the early days. They were not rich, but they were safe, insulated by the father's past service. The fragile stability shattered in 1939. The drums of war began to beat again, this time on the snowy border with Finland. Pavel, despite his earlier rejection of military discipline, was drafted into the Red Army to fight in the Winter War, a conflict Russia launched with hubris and fought with incompetence. He left his family behind, trading the construction site for the frozen hell of the Karelian Isthmus. A few months later, the notification arrived. Pavel Vasilyevich had fallen in battle. The death of the patriarch was a catastrophic blow. Suddenly, the future turned bleak for the four lonely women, Nina and her 3 daughters. The shield of the revolutionary hero was gone, leaving them vulnerable in a world that was about to descend into absolute madness. They were living in Mestersky when history struck its second great blow. In June 1941, Hitler unexpectedly betrayed his pact with Stalin and launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The front line, a churning maw of fire and steel, began to approach Mestersky with terrifying speed. The air raid sirens, the distant rumble of artillery, and the panic in the streets signaled that staying was a death sentence. Nina Vasilyevna, a woman of practical resilience, decided it was better to retreat deeper into the vast interior of Russia with her children. They packed what they could carry, meager possessions that represented the sum of their lives, and set off on foot. It was an arduous journey, a pilgrimage of fear towards a sanctuary that existed only in hope. Their destination was Kirov, in the region of the same name, hundreds of kilometers away. My aunt, my father's brother's wife, lived there, and it was to her that we went, explains Jelena Posnik. They walked until their shoes wore thin, joining the rivers of refugees flowing east, away from the Nazi advance.
When they finally arrived in Kirov, exhausted and footsore, they found only a temporary reprieve. The German army, a mechanized juggernaut, was swallowing territory at an unprecedented rate, and the war was catching up to the refugees even in the hinterlands. By the beginning of 1942, the illusion of safety in Kirov had evaporated. Nina saw the signs, the overcrowding, the food shortages, the proximity of the bombers, and realized they had to move again. They were packing their bags once more, a ritual of displacement that was becoming their way of life. Nina Vasilyevna briefly considered trying to settle in Kozelsk in the Kaluga region, hoping the smaller town might offer obscurity and peace. But upon arrival, the reality of the war economy hit them. The shops were empty, the fields barren or neglected. My mother suddenly said that there was almost nothing there and that we should rather go further south, where at least millet grows, remembers Jelena. It was a decision driven by the most primal instinct, the need to feed her children. They turned south, walking towards the promise of grain. On this leg of the journey, the war revealed its true face to them. It was no longer just distant artillery or lines on a map. It was a visceral, bloody reality. In the village of Baryatinskia, the 4 women encountered a convoy transporting the wounded from the front lines. The sight etched itself into Jelena's memory, a nightmare she would never wake from. They were covered in blood, something terrible, recalls Mrs. Jelena. The trucks were piled with broken men, groaning in agony, their bandages soaked through. The drivers offered the women a ride, a chance to rest their aching legs, but the smell of iron and rot, the sight of the carnage was too much. We preferred to continue on foot, even though we could have gotten a ride. That instinct, that fear of blood, saved their lives. They continued walking along the dusty road, the sounds of the convoy fading ahead of them. After some time, we came across the convoy again, and it was even more terrifying, Mrs. Posnik confesses, her voice heavy with the weight of 80 years of remembrance. The German Luftwaffe had found the convoy. The road was a slaughterhouse. The Germans had shot it all up. Guts were hanging on the wires. Half-dead horses were screaming, and piles of half-naked bodies were lying around. The brutality of this scene was absolute. The machinery of war had reduced men and animals to meat. Even after more than 80 years, I still have that image before my eyes. I can't get rid of it, she says. The screaming of the maimed horses, a sound of pure terror, haunted her dreams long after the war ended. Jelena, her mother, and her sisters eventually found a new home in Liquin, now Chekalin, in the Tula region. The town had been scarred by the war, but was still standing. Here, amidst the ruins and the rebuilding, Jelena was able to start school again. But it was a schooling unlike anything in peacetime. The intellectual class had been decimated. There were almost no teachers there. Some had fallen, some had fled, others were drafted into the army. She reveals about wartime education, the schools were hollow shells, desperate for anyone who could read and write. So they quickly trained at least us, the older students, to be teachers, she recounts. It was a necessity born of desperation. Children were teaching children because the adults were dead or fighting. Before her 19th birthday, Jelena stood at the teacher's desk, a figure of authority in a world that had lost its way. In August 1943, the Soviet authorities assigned her to teach German at a village school in Cherepet in the Chekalin region. It was a twist of fate that would prove cruel. The language her mother had learned in the senator's house, the language of the enemy, was now Jelena's trade. I knew the language a little from my mother, she laughs, a dry sound. To complete the absurdity of the situation, she adds that along with her, a mathematician, a geographer, and a historian also arrived in the village, all people as knowledgeable in their fields as I was. They were a motley crew of hastily trained teenagers propping up the Soviet education system. She served her country as a teacher for nearly 2 years, doing her best to impart knowledge in a time of ignorance. But in June 1945, just as the euphoria of victory over Germany was sweeping the nation, the darkness of Stalin's paranoia descended upon her.
Her crime was not sabotage or espionage, it was conversation. During the occupation, or the chaotic movements of the front, she had once had a simple conversation with German soldiers. It was likely a mundane exchange, perhaps begging for food or asking for safe passage, facilitated by the German she learned from her mother. But to the vigilant eyes of the NKVD, speaking the enemy's tongue was tantamount to treason. There were informers everywhere back then, Jelena Posnik comments today. Someone, perhaps a neighbor or a jealous colleague, had reported her. At the beginning of the summer of 1945, when she should have been celebrating the end of the war, Jelena was stripped of her freedom. Instead of a classroom full of children, she had to quickly get used to the cramped, suffocating silence of solitary confinement in a Tula prison. The transition from respected teacher to enemy of the people was instantaneous. She remembers the interrogation vividly. To this day, I remember the one who was in charge of me. His name was Fedyatov, she says. He was a man who took pride in his appearance, a sharp contrast to the filth of the prison. He was always very well dressed, but how he could humiliate and curse. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. A man in a fine suit spewing the foulest profanities, degrading a young woman for the crime of speaking a language. I don't think I have ever heard such terrible vulgarities before or since. After a few weeks of this psychological torture, she was transferred to a prison in Kaluga. The change of venue brought a small mercy. It was a little better there. I finally came into contact with people again, she says with relief. Solitary confinement had gnawed at her sanity. The presence of other human beings, even fellow prisoners, was a balm. In the grim reality of the cell, she found humanity in the unlikeliest of places. And I also took care of a rat there. It always came running when lunch was served, and I fed it. The rat, a creature of filth, became a companion, a recipient of the compassion the state refused to show her. In October 1945, shortly after her 21st birthday, the gavel fell. She heard the sentence for her crime: 15 years of hard labor. The severity of the punishment was staggering. 15 years of life, stolen for a few words of German. She tried to appeal, clinging to the hope that it was a mistake. But the Soviet legal system was a machine designed to crush, not to correct. The appeal backfired in a way. While the regime changed the verdict to a final 10 years, it sent her to the Gulag. She was transported north, to Molotov's camp, now Severodinsk, in the Arkhangelsk region. It was a landscape of gray ice and gray water. Exhausting work awaited her there, specifically unloading ships at the docks. For a young woman who had spent the last few years in a classroom, the physical toll was devastating. She hauled crates and timber in freezing temperatures, her body breaking down under the strain. Due to total exhaustion, she was eventually declared disabled, a classification that, in the perverse logic of the Gulag, saved her life. She was reassigned to the kitchen to count and check supplies, a job that offered warmth and the occasional scrap of food. Just as quickly as she had turned from a student into a teacher, Jelena Posnik in the camp transformed from a patient into a medical worker. The Soviet system was nothing if not adaptable in its inefficiency. In 1948, there was some amnesty, and suddenly there was a shortage of doctors in the Gulag. The actual doctors had been released or died, leaving a void. So they rounded up people who had at least some education to start attending medical courses. It was a grim parody of medical school. They lasted 6 months, and I met a veterinary student who hadn't finished her studies, and 2 other women about whom I don't even know what they did in life. They just went to some college once. This group of semi-educated prisoners was tasked with keeping the workforce alive enough to labor. The subsequent move from the kitchen to the hospital brought a turning point in her personal life. In 1949, amidst the smell of antiseptic and sickness, she met the camp doctor, Boris Mikhailovich Posnik. He was also a political prisoner, a man of intellect and kindness, trapped in the same nightmare. They fell in love in the shadow of the guard towers, a romance forged in resistance to the dehumanization around them. They promised to marry if they ever tasted freedom again. But before that could happen, they both had to endure the full breadth of the Gulag archipelago. From Molotovsk, Jelena was moved like a pawn on a chessboard. She traveled to Tai-Setlog in Siberia, a transit point for the doomed, and later further east to the dreaded Kolyma. This was the end of the world, the heart of darkness, where the Soviet regime sent those it wanted to disappear.
The journey to Kolyma was a horror story in itself. In the Laperouche Strait near Sakhalin, they loaded us onto a ship. It was called Felix Dzerzhinsky. She notes, the irony of the ship bearing the name of the founder of the secret police not lost on her. But it was nothing more than a captured German steamer. The vessel, once a tool of the Reich, was now a prison transport for the Soviets. It had several decks, and of course, they kept us prisoners on bunks at the very bottom. I had the incredible luck of being assigned the top bunk. Jelena Posnik smiles, a rare expression when discussing those years. The crossing was a nightmare of physical suffering. The sea was rough, the ship was swaying terribly in the waves, and everyone was vomiting. Those who were lying at the very bottom were in a terrible state. The hold became a cesspool of sickness and despair, the prisoners rolling in filth as the ship battered its way through the icy northern waters. But no relief awaited anyone at the destination. They arrived at Butugichog, a camp notorious even among the hardened prisoners of the Gulag. There, in temperatures that plummeted to minus 60 degrees Celsius, the prisoners were forced to mine precious metals. Among the ores was uranium, the deadly fuel for the Soviet nuclear dream. They mined it with practically their bare hands, unaware or uncaring of the invisible poison seeping into their bones. No birds, no trees, no sun, nothing, Mrs. Posnik remembers, describing a landscape of absolute desolation. Just bare rocks in the mountains, where you could barely breathe due to the altitude. It was a place where life was not meant to exist. They didn't even bring us fresh food, and what was available there, we couldn't eat. Everything was radioactive. The very sustenance they were given was slowly killing them. After 2 weeks of this radioactive hell, she was reassigned to logging for a while. Hard labor, but cleaner than the mines. She spent the last 2 years behind barbed wire working as a nurse again, this time in the Magadan prison hospital, tending to the broken bodies of miners and loggers. When the severe frosts began to ease in the northeastern tip of Russia in the summer of 1954, Jelena Posnik could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Her term was up. She was released. But release did not mean freedom. She was marked, a former Zek, and restricted in where she could go. From the camp, she was escorted to the settlement of Buzan in the Dolgomostovsky district of the Krasnoyarsk Krai. This was the place where Boris Mikhailovich Posnik, the doctor she had met in Molotovsk, had been sentenced to exile. He had survived his own journey, and they were reunited in the wild taiga. They married that same year, a ceremony far removed from the bourgeois weddings her parents had despised, but infinitely more meaningful. A few months after the wedding, their son Yuri was born. He was a child of exile, born into a world of restrictions and surveillance. It was only at the end of February 1956, when the political winds shifted, that their true liberation began. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stood before the party Congress and condemned the actions of his predecessor Stalin. The secret speech shattered the cult of personality, and the courts began to massively rehabilitate the Generalissimo's victims. For the Posnik family, this meant a chance for a more normal life. The stigma of the enemy of the people began to fade. Jelena, showing the indomitable spirit that had carried her through the camps, began to study German by correspondence at the Moscow State Institute of Foreign Languages. She completed her studies with success, and then dedicated herself to teaching the language. The very language that had once been her prison sentence, until her retirement. Although the life and health of Jelena Posnik were severely affected by the years spent in the camps, and the radiation and cold had left their marks on her body, she speaks without bitterness. She knows the grim mathematics of her generation. She can speak of luck. She ultimately survived the Stalinist repressions. She lived to see her son grow, to teach again, and to tell her story. Millions of her fellow citizens were not so fortunate. Their voices were silenced forever, ending up in the mass graves of the Soviet Gulag under the permafrost, where no birds sing.